King David was a shepherd, a musician, a father, a warrior, a king. He was all these things, but he also struggled with the same temptations every human being does. Still, his significance in our history made him a prime candidate for my next biblical portrait. When most people think of David, the first scenario that comes to mind is young David versus the giant Goliath. I suppose I could have done this in a larger scale, but I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to portray David in the more significant portion of his life, as a warrior and king. At first, that was my only thought, as I started to pose a figure on top of a hill. The way I tend to do it ends up feeling like I'm sculpting with clay. I like setting up brushes that can add a little, take away a little, smooth a little, and just slowly work out the shapes. It might not be the most efficient way to do it, but it's second nature to me since this is how I've always done it, and it is time consuming, but it still works. After a few hours of trying to get this pose right, I quit. Okay, I didn't actually quit, I just put the build on hold because I was busy with other things. It was a few months later that I finally had time to get back into this build. Coming back to a project after some time always makes you rethink it. And for this build, I suddenly had a new vision. There are many aspects about David's life that I wanted to show in one build, but how to do this? In my previous portrait with Joseph, I opted for doing 3 different versions of him in different stages of his life. I wanted to do something different for David. I didn't want to build him multiple times, but still wanted to somehow show multiple sides of him. That is exactly what I decided to do, show multiple sides of him. In his finished form, he will have 2 sides. One side of him as a warrior/king, one side of him as a shepherd. The trick is to build them in such a way where one side is completely masked by the other. And the way I accomplish this is by first establishing a viewing angle for each side. Depending on how you view this build, you shouldn't be able to see any elements from the opposing side, and therefore I will get 2 builds in one. With a viewing angle determined, I have to tackle my first problem: the clothing. This is always the most challenging part of any build because I am not a seamstress. I don't know how to make clothing. I also don't know what is historically accurate, so I do the best I can with any art I find from past centuries. I started with the clothing for the front-facing side of the build, which is David as a warrior/king, and I knew for a fact I wanted him to be wearing some kind of armor. For now, I'm blocking this out with placeholder blocks. David as a shepherd will be wearing more of a robe or cloak type of outfit, and to make that fit for the warrior side, I turned that robe into looking more like a cape. The trick here is trying to get this robe in a shape that will cover completely the warrior side, but also not look too baggy and out of place on the shepherd side. This is a lot easier said than done. I redid the shape of this robe/cloak many times. It may not look perfect from a 360 view of the build, but as long as it looks good from my 2 chosen perspectives, I'll be satisfied. I think I ended up spending most of my build time on the clothing alone, but for now, I have just the basic shapes blocked out, and I'll continue shaping the rest of the pieces of the figure. I have to fill in details such as hands gripping a staff, shoes, a hand holding a sword, etc. As I continued to build, I was trying to decide how many different objects or hints at David's life could I cram into this build. I'll tell you some of the ideas I didn't do because it would either have been way too much work or it wouldn't have fit within my composition. One idea was to include a dead lion or bear. He did kill those animals to rescue a lamb. That's a bit gruesome. I could build the Ark of the Covenant, since David was the one who brought it back to Jerusalem. I did try that later, but it didn't really fit the composition at all. What if I built David's mighty men? All 37 of them. If this one figure is taking me months to do, I can't imagine doing 37. Even if I tried to simplify them, it's still too much effort. Instead of doing all of those things, I decided to keep it simple. How about I build the slingshot he used to kill Goliath, the harp he used to play to King Saul himself? How about the javelins that Saul used to try to kill David? Or maybe that little piece of garment he ripped from Saul's clothing? That is what I eventually decided to add. Simple objects that have hidden meanings from his life. For now, I'm still tackling this clothing. With every new build I do, I'm always looking for ways to improve my skills, even when I have no clue what I'm doing. Such as the shadowing technique I was trying using the Sculk vein. I spent many hours on that shadow just to have it replaced with glass later on, but you know, it was a fun experiment. Or I overanalyze every little thing I do to try to figure out how in the world can I improve upon this method. A prime example is this scaly armor that David is wearing. It starts with a rough pass where I draw out the shapes of the scales. Then I hand-built each scale one at a time, taking into account how the light might be hitting it. For all of the tutorials I have where I teach how to use commands and how you can use plugins to speed up the building process, still, I find myself doing a lot more hand texturing than anything else. There's something so satisfying about doing it block for block, albeit it does take a lot longer to do. When I finished the chest plate, I decided I was not finished with the chest plate. Something about it was just not quite as good as it could be. It's not that the first version was bad, I knew I could do better, and I had to discover that. I suppose all that extra time was worth it. At least I feel a little bit better about myself knowing that I've tried. I was so relieved to have the toughest side of the build done. I thought the rest of the build was going to be a breeze, but looking at the shepherd side again, I thought, it's not going to work because right now he looks too much like Moses. I need to redo the entire robe again to look like a shepherd, while still covering the other side so it's not visible from this angle. I confess I had to cheat a little bit. The belt appears to be tight around his waist, but in reality it is just as wide and billowing as the cape is on the other side. Only with perspective does the robe appear to be a good fit. Here's a before and after of that adjustment. I think it looks a lot better. No matter how much planning I do, I can never anticipate how something is going to look in game until I do it. It has taken a bit of trial and error, but I'm pleasantly surprised with how this is turning out so far. It is time for me to face the next problem. All I can do is dive in headfirst and hope for the best. I can't ever picture the face before I build it. I just build and accept whatever comes of it. This particular face I spent several hours on, with most of that time being me staring at it, trying to figure out how to improve it some more. It wasn't that long ago when I would have settled for a much lesser detailed face. It's funny how back then I would accept it and move on and not be bothered by it being so simple. But my building has progressed to a point where I can't imagine not putting all these extra details in. It's a natural progression that's happened just because I like to spend more time on things. I decided to add a crown not just to make him look more like a king, but also because he does wear the crown of a conquered king in 2 Samuel 12:30, where the crown is described as being made of gold and precious stones. The tricky thing here is only building half of the crown while keeping the crown hidden from the shepherd side, and trying to get his hair to cooperate with my plans. It turns out that building curly hair to cover the crown on one side but not peek out from behind the crown on the other side is a bit challenging. Who knew there could be bad hair days in Minecraft? I'm almost done with the texturing, which is the worst possible time to be finding mistakes in the proportions of the arms. I did this several times and couldn't seem to get it right. By the end, I still don't know if they are correct, but at least I tried and he survived, so I think we're good. Now to add details to his fingers, his feet, and yes, even his sword, because before, I just did a kind of rough build of the sword, but I wanted to go over it again and make it nice and shiny. You'll also notice that I turned his shepherd's hook into an ordinary staff. It looked a bit out of place on the king's side for him to be holding a shepherd's hook, so I simplified it. The final problem I must work through, if you can even call it a problem, is the environment or the extra details surrounding him. I've already mentioned to you some of these things, but now I am actually going to build it. Of course, I can't depict a shepherd without depicting sheep to go alongside him. I was looking forward to this moment the entire time, because who doesn't love building cute animals? I love any opportunity I have to build something I've never built before, such as sheep. But I can't just have one sheep, it has to be at least 2. Okay, 3, because we needed a lamb in there for the cuteness factor. The most challenging thing for me is deciding how fluffy do I want to make them. Sheep's wool can be very thick or very short depending on how recently it was shorn. I kept their coats mostly short just to make it easier to texture. I think I pulled it off okay. One thing is certain, I did succeed in making them very cute. Just look at that face. Next, I built David's harp. I looked up ideas for what it may have looked like and did my best to style and scale it based on my findings. Much of the land is textured using masks and noise patterns, really simple stuff. Sometimes I painted over areas with brushes, but it's mostly commands. Because my organic is two-sided, I also thought it would be appropriate to have a two-sided look to the terrain, but only in subtle ways. One example of this is the rocks. I textured one side to be one color of gray, and then the other side was a lighter gray color. I put attention to things like that to add a little more separation between the two themes. I was running out of ideas for what to fill in on the king side, so I decided to add a shield with a Star of David. Not that I believe he used a shield like this, but I thought it would be appropriate given this warrior aspect going on over here. And it's also a very clear indication that this is David as soon as you look at it. Next come the javelins I mentioned earlier. These represent the ones that Saul used to attempt to kill him. Attached to one of the javelins is a little strip of cloth that's meant to represent the little strip of robe that David took from Saul to prove to him that he didn't kill him when he had the chance. So far, everything in this build is all towards the front, and there's nothing going on in the back. I like my builds to have a full 360 view, so I need to put something back here to grab attention. How about a scroll with the beginnings of one of David's best known psalms? I did not know an easier way to do this, so I hand wrote this text onto this scroll. As long as it's readable, which I think it is, I think that is a success. To add some finishing touches to the landscape, I designed two different styles of grass, one being green for the shepherd side, one being a more dead-looking grass for the warrior side. Again, I'm looking for any subtle way I can keep those two sides distinct. And since I've kind of created a third area, that is the back where the scroll is, I have to make that also distinct by surrounding it with some simple little white flowers. The terrain doesn't need much more. The main focus of this build is the organic, and I put a lot more time into that for sure. I think overall this is my best biblical portrait, which is always the case when I put a lot more time into things. I hope you enjoyed it as well, and thank you so much for watching and appreciating the beauty of Minecraft building.